And I guess, big picture, I mean, we have a whole bunch of different classes represented today who are in different stages of their journey from ALA on to university and then beyond. And I was just chatting with Shadrach. He was saying he's had a really good year at Columbia. He really feels like he's settled in. And of course, the funny thing about that is that you've only got 1 year left, right? And so just as you're feeling settled in and into your groove, you're also probably feeling a little bit of trepidation around the fact that you are, growing into your next phase on the journey now. And what does that entail, right? And that, from my experience, can just have a whole lot of different types of anxiety associated with it. Career anxiety, what is my purpose? When will I find my moment of obligation? If you heard Mr. Swaniker's graduation speech, what am I going to do with that, and how do I frame that within the shared obligation I feel with the other members of the ALA community to the African continent, and the obligation from our financial assistance if we accepted it and everything else. Okay, so the goal of the next couple hours is to both think about that, to begin to think about that journey first at a high level. What are we doing to set ourselves up to get where we want to go, to have the impact we want to have on the African continent? And then also, what is the impact we want to have on the African continent? Why Africa? Why now? I think you guys know that better than anyone in many ways, but I think there could be some interesting insights from the panelists. The other thing that's really important for us to hear as we think about supporting you on your journey, and this is the purpose of the breakout sessions, is what are some of the things that you're worried about? What are things that you're thinking about with respect to your obligation to ALA? What are some of the things you're thinking about with respect to your obligation to Africa, with respect to how you think about planning a career in the place you want to go? And so those will be some of the things that we'll discuss over the next couple hours. But first, I'd like to hand it over to Mr. Swaniker.
Thank you, Mr. Bradford. He's clapping for himself. I have 6 minutes to talk to you, so I want someone to be my timekeeper. And when I have 1 minute left, put up your hand. Sorry? I'll sing if I go over 6 minutes. So I just want to share a brief perspective, and as the way I think about returning to Africa, and as you go on and study overseas, and most of you then have this choice about, do you come back to Africa or do you stay overseas? And the way I look at it is, there's one way to think about it as an obligation. Another way to think about it is as an opportunity. I tend to think about it as on the latter part. I think that the chance to return to Africa and do work on the continent, from my experience of coming back straight after I graduated and having spent the last 13 years working in Africa, I think this is one of the greatest opportunities of our lifetime, of our generation. If I think about the last three centuries, there have been different periods of time where there have been great opportunities in different parts of the world. So towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you had the Industrial Revolution and the growth of the British Empire and so forth, and that was where they experienced a big boom. And then you went to the 20th century, and you had Japan and Singapore in the 50s and 60s, and Korea and the boom they went through. And then you had the internet and the computer revolution that took place in the US and so forth, and boom. And now as we look at the 21st century, there's some big movements and trends that are taking place that are going to make sure that this century is a really fantastic century for Africa. The first is, increasing political stability. So if you think about coming back to Africa 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the picture was very, very different from what it looks like today. 30 out of the 50 countries in Africa were in some form of conflict. Today it's less than 5. and most countries in Africa have democracy and peace and stability and so forth. There's still flashpoints here and there, but it's a much, much more stable continent to be coming back to. The second big trend is that one big thing that I'm not sure you're all aware of, which is a huge opportunity, is around urbanization and what that's going to do for growing economies in Africa. Right now, there are about 400 million people that live in cities in Africa. That number is going to grow to 1.2 billion by the year 2050. So 800 million people are going to be moving into cities in Africa. And what that means is, as people come together, cities are the bedrocks of economic growth because they bring together people who have goods and services to sell with those who need to buy them. And they really create the market economy. And there's thousands of things that come out of that. If you think about the housing that needs to be built, and infrastructure that needs to be built, and you get to be, the people who built the railroads in the US and became the barons, the people who, like Leland Stanford, the guy who gave the endowment to start Stanford. He made his wealth from building railroads in the US. And we have the chance to do that and build the pipelines and build the houses. Nigeria has a backlog of 17 million homes that need to be built because of this urbanization, but they're only building 150,000 of them every year. Can you imagine what you can do if you are the one who goes and builds those homes in Nigeria? Billions to be made. Right, so that trend is a big, big trend that we need to think about. The third trend is the increasing stock of human capital that we have on this continent, which means we can do and capture a lot of the economic growth potential in the continent. When Ghana got independence in 1957, there was something like I've seen numbers of between 18,000 and 21,000 university graduates in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, if you exclude South Africa. Of those 21,000, let's say, 18,000 came from two countries, Ghana and Nigeria. The DRC, Congo, had about 18 university graduates. And when Kenneth Kaunda was putting together his cabinet, he had 1 or 2 university graduates to work with. So can you imagine trying to create a nation with such limited human capital? Fast forward 50 years, we have millions. Yes, we're still way behind the rest of the world in terms of the stock of human capital and education that we have. But we have millions of university graduates now, millions of high school graduates, almost close to universal primary education and very high levels or increasing levels of secondary education. So we have much brighter people, better human capital that, if you want to build ventures and create organizations, you have better qualified and educated people that you can work with. The final trend that I'll talk about, how much time do I have left? 1 minute left, okay. The final trend that I'm excited about is about the increasing interest of the rest of the world in Africa and what that means for us and what are the opportunities that we have to capture. So we you heard from John Thornton on Friday about China and the increasing role that they're playing here. I went to China last year and I was blown away by what I saw. And I came back and actually wrote a paper called Why Every African Leader Needs to Go to China. I haven't finished it yet. But China has a plan for us. We need to create a plan for China, right? And how can we take full advantage of all this money that they're bringing in here and so forth so that we make sure we get the most out of it as well. The economies in the US and Europe are in huge turmoil. There's a global financial crisis in the US. It's very hard to get jobs there now. You have the Eurozone crisis and all that stuff. And another big thing that's happening is the aging population of those countries, right? So that means the average age of an African is 19. The average age of a German or a Japanese is 44, right? And that means you have a lot of people retiring there. They need to get the pension funds and so forth that need to look after those guys, need to get high and high returns. The economies are going down, so where do they have to invest? Here. And who are the people they're going to be looking to invest in? Who's going to be best placed to actually, make that investment work and make money from that? It's all of you. It's this generation. The people who are best qualified to actually capture this. So there's never been a better time to be coming back to Africa than this time that you are being born in. And there's something about being born in the right place and the right time. And you are really fortunate to have been born in that time. And so as you think about it, I really want you to have this perspective and take time to understand these trends and think about how, 50 years from now, imagine you were born in China 20 or 30 years ago when it was just starting to take off. You are being born in this time now, you're coming of age in this time now in Africa. How do you take advantage of that? How do you think about that and not miss out? So that when you're 60 or 70, you're looking back and saying, man, I wish I had been part of that revolution that took place in Africa. Stop there. How did I do?
Pretty well. You are.
So it's video time. Like to thank everyone who was involved with the HBS Africa Business Conference, and I think it was the Breakmans who helped capture some different people talking about their thoughts on some of those big trends and opportunities on the continent.
So the problem with the opportunity in Africa is it means that there aren't clear pathways. And so the biggest problem that I think almost all of my students have and almost all of the young people whom I speak to have is that they would like to have a very clear path. They'd like to know what things are going to look like in 1 year, what things are going to look like in 5 years, what things are going to look like in 15 years. They'd like a mentor who's done exactly the same thing. They'd like to know how much they're going to make, where they're going to live, what kind of house they're going to have. And I simply can't give them an answer to any of those questions because the jobs that they're going to do haven't been created yet. And so I can't tell you how many students I have who graduate, who decide to go back to Africa, who don't know really what they're going to do, or who take a job that isn't exactly the job that they think they want. Once they get on the ground, they go out and they discover that meeting people is really the way to find out what's happening. It's the way to find firms that you wouldn't have been able to find in Boston or in New York or in London.
So when I started with BCG about 14 years ago, I started in the Los Angeles office. I realized pretty quickly that much of the work that we were doing was for clients that had no real relevance for Africa. Of all of the offices we had in the US, the one that had something relevant was our Houston office, which was serving oil and gas clients. And then further moved to Dubai. After spending another 2 or 3 years there, I moved to South Africa to open our first office in sub-Saharan Africa. And part of it is, as Africans, we have to bring the rest of the world along with us. We have to increase the understanding of Africa. We have to bring their skills and their resources and their hard work and enthusiasm to the continent. And doing that also requires making thoughtful moves accordingly. It would have been very easy for me to just pull the plug and move to Ethiopia and start my own thing or pursue employment there. But what I saw was an opportunity here to bring all 7,000 of my colleagues along.
We see alums who have had a large number of careers over the course of their lives, and almost none of them ended up the way they thought they were going to, and most of them have taken them all over the world. And so the thing that one does at 27 is not the thing that one is going to do at 45 for most people nowadays.
To be honest, I never had a proper plan from day one of how I was going to go from England, US, back to Africa. From the very day I left Nigeria to go to England, I was just focusing on the here and now. How can I do the best for me today to gain experience, and most importantly, to give myself options in terms of what I can do later.
And initially I thought I was going to move back to South Africa because that's where I was before I moved to Washington, and someone gave me an offer to go to Nigeria. And I spent my last 4 years in Nigeria, which was exceptional. It was definitely challenging coming from a different background. And it was very scary because I had never lived in Nigeria, and I knew some people, but it was a completely different environment, and I had a lot of things to weigh. And I run my own business, and I left the law. And this is how the impact of moving to Nigeria was. I left the law and I run a small manufacturing business in Zambia, and I manufacture instant noodles, which are called Easy.
So if you join Procter & Gamble or Unilever here, or join Goldman Sachs, etc., you can get get immersed into the culture of the organization whilst you're still in the US or in the UK, and then put your hand up for an opportunity to go to Africa. And there's not a sense of giving something up because you're still in a global organization, you're still mobile.
If the opportunity presents itself within a context that is familiar, where your networks exist, where you have understood the historical persuasions that have allowed you to be, as a country, where you are, it may be easier to plug in at that point. And that there's nothing wrong with that. And that it doesn't make you any less Pan-African for opting to be based home.
The one thing that I discovered, and it's probably still the same, is because African economies are young economies. You tend to get opportunities much earlier in your career to have greater responsibilities. So if you look at the average ages of senior executives in African economies, they're a lot younger than in Europe. So in terms of one making a decision to move back to Africa, that's a massive consideration. I think that now there's a second wave of enthusiasm about Africa, but it's more realistic enthusiasm, because if you talk about 10 years ago, companies were saying we need to get into Africa. So they would send people with briefcases all over the place, etc., and with a view that Africa is a homogeneous continent. So some banks would go and buy banks in different places, but actually realizing when they get there that there are actually 54 different jurisdictions. And some of them are not attractive because they've got a population of less than 1 million people. And therefore, it's not just about being everywhere. Doing business in Nigeria is completely different to doing business in Kenya.
It is very important for them to understand that this is a new day in Africa, that the opportunities that face this continent are greatly incomparable to most continents of the world, that there are emerging and exciting new opportunities to engage at an economic level, at a social level, and even at a political leadership level.
So this is a very pro move back advice, but I think this is the time is now. There's no better time than now.
What if it was a 419, as they say? You know, it could be the biggest career 419 in my life. But all I remember is that you're well educated and you're worldly, because you actually don't belong to one place. That if it didn't work out, you would find something else to do.
I think sometimes there's a danger in overthinking these things. Everybody knows the difficulties of Africa, and it's a difficult operating environment and there are challenges, but if you continue to just think about things that way and how easy things are in the West, you're going to miss out on the opportunities that are there. And quite frankly, you know, the young Africans, we have a benefit of schooling abroad in really good schools. You've been sort of taught to think and challenge yourself intellectually, and that's something that you always have.
So someday I hope to take the firm to Ethiopia, but South Africa was the natural entry point. And I think for most students who are in the US or who are considering Western education, there's a lesson in that, you know, picking up skills in the West and preparing yourself before you move back so that you hit the ground running when you do. So you have the reputation and also the experience. I think is a critical one that I would want to impart to ALA students.
I have a vague long-term goal that, you know, you're going to do something in a certain area, but focus on gaining skills and experience that can allow you to do many more things at any one point in time. And then, you know, when you wake up and decide, okay, you know, this year or next year I want to move back to Africa or move anywhere else, then you're in a position to actually do that in a way that benefits you.
You must invest in yourself. That's something that whether it's the political system or the environment will not take away from you. If you develop skills, increase your own personal value and worth.
I wouldn't have been able to do what I did if I didn't work for who I did. I worked for one of the biggest entrepreneurs in Africa, Aliko Dangote, for almost 4 years. And that was my luck. He taught me a lot about business, about taking calculated risks, about not being afraid, about also believing in yourself. Nothing is impossible. He said, yeah, lots of people, you fail, but you fail tests too, right? You know, and you get up, you dust yourself, what's the next big thing? as in with everything you do. Even when you apply to college, you put in your preparation time. It's the same thing with your career and your transition. So I would say if you're out here, speak to people. I mean, we all have a family member who's working at home and who's got a high enough profile, or who may not be working, but who'll tell you what the environment is like, and keep relevant. What's the great thing about online publications? You can read what's happening at home in any country online, but keep abreast with what's happening. Network. Network at great conferences like the HBS conference, for instance, and ask the questions like, but what is this company doing? Are they really doing it? Are you a decision maker, or are you taking instructions from Washington or New York or London? I mean, but are you really doing something? And I would say don't rush it. There will always be the right time. I mean, sometimes you need to do your time. You need to get the experience. And if you feel that the best experience for you will be here to build, then do it here. And there will be a right, when you know, when you've done maybe 2, 3 years or 5 years, and you know you feel like you're a very confident banker, then maybe it's time to speak to African banks, or actually international banks who operate in Africa. And keep those avenues open, because there will always be an opening. We have commercial hubs in Johannesburg, in Nairobi, in Lagos, in Dakar, in Accra. So there's so many opportunities, but they won't come to you unless you seek them.
When one's making a decision about going back to Africa, it's not necessarily something you can entirely work out on paper. It really comes from a much deeper place, and it's about a passion. It's about where your heart wants to be. I think that the decision to go back to Africa is one that is so deep, it's so emotional, it's so visceral. I think about my first visit to Nigeria. I had met someone, a businesswoman, a graduate from Harvard. I'd met her in her life as a high-flying banker in New York. And I knew that she had decided to go back to Nigeria. Going home, this is a woman who could have lived, on Park Avenue in New York. She could have lived in Hyde Park in London. She could have been anywhere in the world she wanted to be. But home meant so much more to her. It didn't matter that there was rubbish outside and dogs grazing around. She wanted to be where she was comfortable. She wanted to be where her family was. She wanted to be with her siblings. She wanted to speak in her language. She wanted to have pepper soup that her mom made on Sundays.
I have learned to be at home wherever I put my suitcase and decide to spend so many years with my family. So if, as an African, I want to contribute to the development of my country, today, I don't need anymore to go back to that country. That was the dilemma 30 years ago when I was at university, because to contribute was to be physically in my country. But today, with the ICTs, you could be in Los Angeles as a surgeon and be working with another surgeon in Nigeria, being in a surgery room, and contribute to the development of health in Nigeria. So I believe that young people should not put that stress on their shoulders, believing that they still need to go back home before being able to do something. First of all, they must learn to be happy where they are, even if they are just there temporarily for a few years, to say, I am here now, I have to be happy here. Tomorrow, if I go somewhere else, I will learn how to be happy. And when I go back home, I will be able also to contribute in a different way. But I could contribute also to the development of my country in another way, wherever I live in this world.
All right, so, yeah, Amy. Okay, well, thank you very much for the work you did in interviewing that range of people, which I thought was pretty awesome. So once again, thank you to the Brakeman's. Amazing. So we're going to break into some groups to talk about questions you have as you're thinking about your career path, and those can be questions of of any kind. So as you think about your path back to Africa, and what we want to do is we want to capture some of those questions, because what we need to be able to do as ALA, as we grow into the next phase of our life as an institution, and this is something you'll hear me talk about later in the day, is we need to think about, well, what is the life of our graduates like at this time, and how can we help to support them? Okay, what are the questions that are bouncing up and down in your heads that you're striving to have an answer on? All right, and what we're really going to do is transcribe those questions and capture those, send them back to you, and then hopefully work together to answer them. Okay. As an aside, just wanted to highlight two things that I noticed in the video. So one, I remember I was in Nigeria in February, and I was talking to a group of several hundred parents about universities, and then as these things go, the questions start to talk about education more broadly. And one of the things that I remember saying at that time was, what's very interesting about building a school like ALA is that you're preparing young people for jobs that don't exist today. Right? So if you think about it, I was with Mr. Cheney. We were saying, when we were born, HIV/AIDS did not exist. Mobile telephones did not exist. When I graduated from high school, the internet had just debuted. Mobile phones did not exist except for these big hulking things you could plug into cars, and you had to put a magnetic antenna that was this big on top of the car. And I think this is what you guys are going to experience as well. 20 years from now, the vast majority of ALA graduates will work either, one, in a job that no one has thought of today, that does not exist today, or for a firm that has not been created yet. And how do you think about your career in the context of all of those unknowns? Very different from my sister, who is a doctor, right? Following in a very similar career path to the one that my father did. My father is also a doctor, right? You are entering a career with many unknowns. So then this brings me up to graduation day on Friday. And on graduation day, I saw someone who was my year at university, like me, an American whose heart is sort of in Africa. And he moved here the year we graduated from school. And he moved here to take a chance when all of his classmates, we went to very similar schools where people go off to work for investment banks and consulting firms. Neither of us did. All of his classmates went off to Wall Street, and he came to Africa to work for a startup investment firm that was looking at the opportunity to bring mobile telephones to Africa. His parents thought that was a crazy career risk. As I said, he's my age. He's been retired for 3 years. He's now built a foundation that's looking at education and some education innovations on the continent. And I just find that really interesting, thinking about that risk-reward calculus. How do you know the trade-off between getting skills and following your gut, and when and where? So Kate, you can share with us the groups, and we'll spend a few minutes sort of charting questions that you have as you think about your career path.